of 1973, I looked around, and because of the changes, I saw such a lack of faith in ourselves as individual Americans, and still do to a certain extent. A lack of faith in ourselves to look around us and see the things that are wrong and still believe that we can make a difference in changing them, to make them right. A lack of faith in ourselves as individual citizens to still maintain control of our system and to contribute positively. A lack of faith in ourselves as Christians or as spiritual believers to believe that no matter how much we may falter, how we may sometimes fail and be disappointed in ourselves, that we can still bounce back, and to keep faith in our ability to do that. A lack of faith in ourselves to espouse our beliefs, whether they be patriotic or spiritual, not be embarrassed about doing it. A lack of faith in ourselves to plant our feet somewhere and say, this is right and this is wrong, and by God, I know the difference. And not be swayed by the modes and fashions and styles of that particular day. Keeping faith in ourselves to live out, to gut out those prison-like aspects of our daily routine whereby we're not totally free, but we have to fulfill the consequences and responsibilities of the decisions that we've taken for ourselves back up the pike somewhere. And as much as we might wish things were different, or that we were somewhere else or someone else doing something else, it isn't to be. So without resorting to those crutches of booze or drugs or whatever, we gut it out. We hack it. Keeping faith in ourselves to do that as necessary. Keeping faith in my fellow man there in prison in Hanoi. Being sure, knowing for certain that every man in every cell, whether he be in contact and communication or not, was doing his very utmost to resist as you were, to obey that code of conduct as you were. But the Vietnamese realized that there was strength in unity, and they kept us separated for as long as they could. It was forbidden to even communicate or see another American. But that became our foremost challenge, to bring every man into our communication system and to persist with that communications. And we developed a technique to communicate which was the basis for all of our communicating, called tap code. And I'd like to share with you how that worked. Tap code was a means of tapping on the wall. Not body language, but I guess you'd call it knuckle language. And it was based upon a little matrix of 25 letters. We leave out the letter K of the alphabet because we can use a C instead of a K. And this 25-letter matrix was composed of 5 rows of 5 letters. So I had 5 rows and 5 columns of letters with A through E across the top, F through J across the second row, and so on, with Z down in the lower right-hand corner. So that if I want to tap an A on the wall, I tap once because A is in the first row, and once because A is in the first column. B is in the first row, second column. C is in the first row, third column. F, second row, first column. And of course, Z. We developed our own shorthand, our own abbreviations, our own slang, and several times the Vietnamese tried to intercept messages tapped this way, and there was simply no way they could keep up with us. You'd call up the man next to you, naturally, and he'd respond, of course, and then you could spend several hours a day tapping on the wall, visiting with your neighbor, providing mutual strength and sustenance to each other. We tapped so much that we began to have calluses on our knuckles, and pretty soon the guards got wise. We'd just grab your hand and look and see if you had calluses, and sure enough, if you did, you were guilty and you'd be punished. So we began to tap with little pieces of metal and rocks and so on to spare ourselves at least that aspect of the punishment. You'd come back from an interrogation session and you want to pass a piece of hot news that you'd gained, and you get up on the wall and pass it along, and then in a few minutes put your ear to the wall, and the whole cell block would sound like an office full of professional secretaries pounding away on their typewriters. You'd spend hours with the man next to you, and you'd get to know him like your own brother, but you wouldn't get to see him or meet him or hug him for 4 or 5 or 6 years, maybe 7. We developed tap code further. Sometimes we were allowed to sweep out our cells with a bucket of water and a stiff bamboo broom until you'd slosh the water through the cell and take this broom and go down on the deck and say swish, 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 and the whole cell block could hear you, you know. And we also developed tap code in other ways. There was one small prison on the outskirts of Hanoi where every cell was a separate hut. There were no common walls, and communicating was very difficult. But like everywhere else in North Vietnam, the drinking water had to be boiled. And someone had to chop the wood to build the fire, to boil the water. And every morning, a new American was out there, chop, 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 chop. The whole countryside could hear, you know, but every American in every cell was being kept apprised, and the continuity of the resistance policy was being maintained. And we were drawing strength and sustenance and confidence from that communication. The final refinement, I think, to tap code was something we developed called vocal tap. And this is where we replace the taps by noises that we make as human beings. For example, so you could cough and hack and sniff and sputter all day long, you know. Communicating, taking it upon yourself as a sacred obligation to bring each new man into the communication system, taking any risk, risking the punishment if necessary, but making sure that every man was aboard. And you know, when the man in the cell next to you was down and hurting and they were really leaning on him hard, if you could just clear that little crack under your door to watch for the shadow of a guard and get to the wall long enough to tap GB, and that meant God bless. And he knew that also meant, be tough, babe, hang in there. I'm praying for you. And you were. And at night, when all was quiet, it was so comforting to hear the man next to you come up on the wall very softly and tap. GN, good night. GBA, God bless America. Keeping faith in our families so far away, realizing that for us, our existence in that vacuum-like place was very easy and our duty was very clear-cut. But realizing that for our families back home, facing the problems and trials and temptations of daily living in a complex world and society, it wasn't that easy. Being true, keeping faith, and in my case, that faith was more than fulfilled. Keeping faith in the Vietnamese as fellow human beings, hoping, realizing that they would show compassion when necessary, sympathy, mercy as necessary, and indeed I experienced several of those occasions. Keeping faith with our fellow Americans at home, not the least of which was our government, and the policies of that government in the pursuit of the Vietnam War. And let me tell you that the entire time I was there, on a daily basis, my convictions in that cause grew because I was able to see and experience firsthand the alternative. Every single day for those 7 years, through the loudspeakers that were in every cell with no on-off or volume switch, through the reading material that was supplied by Hanoi Press, I heard everything that was bad about the United States of America. All that was negative, all that was sensational, all that we had the least to be proud of. We heard about the crime, the corruption, the riots, the demonstrations, the instability, the hurricanes, the forest fires, the details of the Manson murders, the Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King assassinations, all of the things that would make us feel sad and bad about our country. And sometimes after that overwhelming deluge of negative propaganda, the cumulative effect would begin to get to you, and you'd have to get a hold of yourself and say, hey, wait a minute, babe, don't believe all that junk. You're an American, you've been there, you know what your country's like. Keep faith in America. Keep faith. You'd have to reach way back into your past sometimes to the words that perhaps some high school history or civics teacher had told you, or maybe the words of a Boy Scout master, or your uncle who'd fought in World War II, to the things that they had told you about your country and why you could keep faith in the reasons to sacrifice and sometimes die for that country. Keeping faith in America there in Hanoi was not always that easy, but we did. And when I returned to America, and still on a daily basis, I open the morning newspaper or listen to the news radio on the way to work or the TV news, and you guessed it, what do we see? The bad, the sensational, everything that sells news, all that we have the least to be proud of. And sometimes with that overwhelming deluge of propaganda too, right here at home, it's difficult to keep from being sucked into that rut of cynicism and sarcasm about our country and about our system. It's hard to remember how it's worked for us so well, when in fact we live in the greatest democracy that's ever existed on the face of the earth. A democracy that provides for us as individuals the potential to reach any level we want as we please, depending upon our own ambition and energy. Freedom. As a nation, we've achieved so much in scientific fields, economy, medical. We have so many reasons to keep faith in America. So many reminders on a daily basis, not the least of which are the refugees that we see striving to get to the countries of the West, all the ones that harbor our kind of government, the ones that we share with our allies. We have a system that's endured for over 200 years, and there's got to be a reason for that. Some people said we wouldn't even get through the 70s, but of course we did. Keeping faith in God as well. In Hanoi, as I said at the outset, I prayed a lot. The first words that I saw scratched on a cell wall by another American were simply, God equals strength. And for me it worked. I was never alone. And every day, each man had his own spiritual routine, sometimes lasting for hours. But for sure on Sunday mornings, the senior man of each cell block would pass the church signal through the wall, wait a few minutes for it to circulate throughout the rest of the cell block, and then every man would stand in his cell, and in some semblance of togetherness, we would recite the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag. The Lord's Prayer. Sometimes the 23rd Psalm, dwelling upon that verse that says, Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. And we realized as we looked at the officers and guards around us that it was our cup that runneth over, not theirs, because someday we would go home. Even though we were behind those bars, we were still free, and they would have to stay there in that system of theirs for the rest of their lives. And it was our cup that runneth over. Easter of 1966, not very long after I was shot down, I was taken out of my cell one night, told to put on my long-sleeve shirt, down through the corridors of Wallow Prison, and into a very brightly lit interrogation room, a table with a blue cloth, a little teapot there with a dish of candy and cookies and teacups, and a large group of officers and guards standing around to the side. And seated across the table was a very old and venerable Vietnamese priest. His name was Father Jean-Baptiste Ho Tam Dien. It's one of a dying breed because, they're not making any more priests in Vietnam, north or south. And he was there to hear my Easter confession and to give me communion. And as I sat down across from him, I could immediately see mirrored in the little rimless spectacles that he wore the hand signals of the officer behind me as he told him that it was his Christian duty to tell me that it was my Christian duty to make propaganda for the prison authorities, to write letters to my congressmen, to my senators, to my president, to the GIs in the South, telling them to bring this war to an end, to demonstrate, to protest. And he knew that he was being used, compromised. But he was fighting for his survival, just like I was. Well, that night he gave me a little plastic rosary with the beads. And I took that rosary back to my cell, which kind of surprised me because normally we weren't allowed to keep anything that wasn't specifically issued. And I had the rosary with me for several years. and I derived a great deal of comfort from it. Not just spiritual comfort, because I soon found that when I was being punished for whatever reason, and my legs were in those stocks at the foot of my slab, and my hands were cuffed behind me, and had been that way for 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and I just didn't know how I was going to get through the next day or night. Using that little rosary as a key, I could open almost any pair of handcuffs that they could find to put on me. Honest to God. And in the middle of the night, the man next to me would be on his hands and knees with his face pressed against the deck, clearing through the crack under his door so that I could undo my cuffs and put my arms in front and lay back and get a little sleep or rest my shoulders. And he'd give me a danger thump on the wall when a guard was approaching. And I could sit back up and put my hands behind so that it would look like I was still cuffed when the guard opened the little peephole to check. And then in a couple of weeks, I'd be down on my hands and knees for him while he got out of his cuffs his way. One day I was pacing back and forth in my cell, and I had the rosary in my hand, and a particularly mean, vindictive guard came up, opened the little peephole, and demanded to see what I had in my hand. So I handed him the rosary. He snatched it away. He already knew what it was. And while he was looking at the rosary, I asked him this question. I said, "Do you believe in God?" And he knew exactly what I had asked. And his answer was so poignant. He simply pointed the rank insignia on his shoulder, shook his head. And it was obvious that for him there simply wasn't room for Christ or Buddha or Muhammad or any other prophet and Ho Chi Minh. There wasn't room for Christianity or Buddhism or Mohammedanism and communism, for indeed those were his religion. And that would be all he would know. And it reminded me at that time how blessed we are as Americans to be free to worship or not worship as we see fit, to gather just like this and discuss it and not make a great political extravaganza out of it, having the content dictated to us. And when I returned to America in 1973, I was appalled at how little credit we gave to the spiritual aspects of our lives, how much we had forgotten how much spirit there is to the basis of our own society, of our own country. Our loss of that awareness, our loss of the humility that goes with the belief in something so much more great, something more powerful than we, as frail human beings. And how many reminders there are of that spirituality for us if we just look. A couple of years ago, while I was stationed in Washington, as I would jog at noon down the Monument Trail, passing the Jefferson Memorial, the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, I would frequently stop and reread the tracts of the quotations of our founding fathers. And I was always struck by how frequently they referred to spiritual strength and spiritual guidance and divine providence. It's been there from the outset, you know. And every day, although we take it so much for granted, we still use money that says, "In God we trust." And when we pledge allegiance to our flag, we still say, "One nation, under God." And I've heard it said that so long as America can stay great, and by great I mean righteous, ethical, moral, humble, merciful, so long as America can stay great, good, America will stay great. And I really believe that. And there were a few men among me there in Hanoi who were espoused atheists or agnostics, their choice. They didn't have the practice in believing in something that they couldn't see or touch or smell. And they had a hard time keeping faith in themselves and in their fellow men, both in prison and at home, and in their country and its cause. And I don't think that was any accident. Keeping faith in God. Those four aspects of faith, faith in myself, faith in my fellow man, faith in my country, and faith in God, sustain me through that time and work for me every day. And I would suggest that they can help anyone on that same basis. That was the key to my survival. And at the outset I said, it wasn't just my experience, it was yours as well, in so many more ways than you may realize just now. And that was brought home to me when we came home. And I had friends, and sometimes strangers would come up and say, boy, I watched you guys on television, the way you came home, the things that you said when you got off those big airplanes at Clark Air Base in the Philippines. The things that you said, like, we're honored to have had the opportunity to serve our country during adverse times. We're grateful to our Commander-in-Chief and to the people of our nation. God bless America. When you guys said those things, it made me feel so proud. I felt so good. Because you can be sure that if you had come home in those circumstances, whatever your role may have been in that whole experience, you would have come home the same way, you would have met us the same way, you would have said the same words, because we all derive our strength from the same source. We're all of the same clay and spirit. And just as I was in your hearts and your prayers during all those years, you were there in Hanoi with me, giving me strength and sustenance all that time. For 7 years, the Vietnamese tried to break my spirit, my confidence, my faith, and they couldn't do that. And in great part, the reason is right here before me today. All of you, for your help, for your performance there in Hanoi with me. I'm very, very proud. And I'd like to say thank you. And God bless.
This is the end of Side 8. Side 7 is already queued up for your next listening.